So the Socratic man then is the enemy of all culture because he is the avatar of science. And when science takes the field in a culture, then it begins to sterilize the culture out of existence. This will become the key insight that Spengler will later pick up for his theory of the decline of civilizations, which basically will state that once the Socratic man comes on stage into a culture, the culture begins to disintegrate under the light of the impacts of science and reason and rationalism. He says, for example, that Buddha is the Socratic man of Indian civilization. In Western civilization, the Socratic man is Rousseau and Voltaire and the rationalism of the Enlightenment, and that in China, the rise of the Socratic man is Confucius, and so forth. And once the Socratic man begins to appear on stage, then we have the earliest beginnings for the coming of nihilism. Early Buddhism, for example, Spengler says is completely nihilistic. It gets rid of the gods, it gets rid of the soul, it wipes everything out. And same thing within the West. He says socialism eventually is the nihilistic philosophy that evolves eventually out of the movement that started with Rousseau and Voltaire and the rise of rationalism, which sterilizes everything. And once this happens, once reason gets the upper hand in a culture, it begins to question everything. It begins to question ritual, myth, and tradition. The myths disintegrate, ritual stops being practiced, and eventually the culture begins to fall apart because once reason sterilizes everything, it's basically destructive. Science is a basically destructive force, and that's one of the things that Nietzsche understood here, and one of the things that has motivated my own writings, for example, is this insight that science is fundamentally not creative. It's a destructive force. And for example, Nietzsche says one of the basic things about Socrates, the way he created was the opposite of the way that creativity normally works. He says that the daimon of Socrates was what warned him against things. And whereas the instinctive basis of wisdom is what normally inspires an individual to create, and his reason is something that warns him, in Socrates it was the other way around. It's his reason, his intellect, that is creative, and the instincts that warn him against this rampant creativity. So Socrates really had a disintegrative impact on Greek culture. I mean, the degree of the disintegrative impact cannot be overestimated, I think. Even in Eric Havelock's book, Preface to Plato, for example, where he goes back and he looks at, he wants to answer the question of why it is that Plato, when he wrote the Republic, banned all poets from it. And he says, well, what really happened is because under the influence of Socrates, at the time Plato was writing, Greek culture was becoming literate in a new way, and it was detribalizing the individual. It was cutting him off from the traditions of orality, in which, the great Homeric tradition is that the Homeric epics, which are passed along orally by word of mouth, were tribal encyclopedias that contain the entire body of knowledge within the culture that is passed along from mouth to mouth and from generation to generation, so that when the individual wants to reason or think about something, he simply remembers what he's learned by rote and recites it. But what Socrates does is he goes around and he questions this. He puts people through the Socratic method where he questions all of their assumptions. He asks them what justice is, and they give a proverbial reply without thinking about it, because that's the oral tradition. And Socrates then forces them to examine their assumptions and to realize that there's a problem here. What he's doing is he's carefully cutting out the oral tradition and trying to get individuals to think for themselves. This might seem a good thing, and it generally has been celebrated as a good thing, this detribalization, the rise of literacy. Literacy was on the rise. Euripides was said to be the first man to own his own private library in this time. And plays were written down and books distributed for the first time because people wanted copies of the plays of Euripides. They wanted to be able to read them. And so Socrates was teaching people how to think, but on the other hand, as Nietzsche points out, it's an incredibly destructive. The intellect is absolutely destructive. It's not fundamentally creative. Creativity springs from deeper well springs. The muses, the instinctive wisdom that comes out of us is where creativity comes from. The intellect is a secondary phenomenon. It's not creative, it's analytic. It pulls things apart. It does not create them, which is two completely different faculties of the human mind. And so then Nietzsche continues his analysis by saying that with Plato then, Plato started out as a tragedian who was frustrated, probably because of his relationship with Socrates, who got him to start questioning his own writings. And he burned his own writings so that he could become a pupil of Socrates. And then in doing so, the Platonic dialogues were essentially, as he says, the life raft upon which Greek tragedy stayed afloat for a while longer, because they are, after all, dialogues. Although they're written to be read, not performed, And he says that, just as McLuhan says, that every new medium, the content of every new medium is a preceding medium, Nietzsche says the content of the Platonic dialogues are all the previous tragedies and dramas, which themselves in turn, as he has already demonstrated, the content of those plays was the Homeric epics and the lyrical tradition that had begun with Archilochus. And so with Plato, we begin to get the final sunset effect of the whole development, and Plato's works even lay the beginnings of the foundation for what will later become the novel, the Hellenistic invention of the novel in the 2nd century BC that will come out of that prosaic tradition. But it comes out of a decadent period, the Alexandrian period, in which the sciences gain the field as they have today in our culture. We too are living in an Alexandrian age which regards reason as the utmost thing. And we've got the Socratic man nowadays in our culture as the norm. And we even regard the Socratic, I mean, the Carl Sagans and the Isaac Asimovs in philosophy, the Jürgen Habermases, these are all manifestations of the Socratic man, for whom reason is all that matters, and the only thing that matters. And the idea of respect for and recognition of spirituality, you know, all that's gone. Spirituality is swept out the door without further ado, and ritual, symbol, and myth are regarded as relics left over from the childhood of man, not to be taken seriously. And so that's the situation that we're at now, and that Spengler wrote The Decline of the West to elucidate, coming out of this Nietzschean tradition. You won't hear much talk in postmodern philosophy of the birth of tragedy. Nietzsche has become a major ancestor figure in postmodern thought, in critical theory, but it's the later Nietzsche, the Nietzsche of beyond good and evil, and of the genealogy of morals that these men evoke, not the Nietzsche who wrote The Birth of Tragedy and who saw the Socratic man as the enemy, as the basic antithesis of art and culture. And so, as the result of the coming on stage of the Socratic man and the idea of reason being the ultimate thing, the arts are in a state of chaos now, and our culture is disintegrating. Now, all this appeals very much to the right, so I don't want to make it sound like I'm, apologizing for some kind of right-wing view here. I'm a card-carrying liberal, and I'm not in the least bit right-wing at all. But theories of decadence and Spengler and Nietzsche are very popular with the right, but Nietzsche is also very popular with the left, although Spengler isn't. But it is important to understand the dynamics of culture, I think, how it works, what causes it to fall apart. And I personally am of the view that science is absolutely a destructive force on culture. Every new gadget that comes along, as Neil Postman points out, undoes a previous way of life. The automobile is the antithesis of the city. It basically has destroyed the city, destroyed communities and neighborhoods of every kind. Every new gadget that comes along undoes an entire way of life. This is what I wrote my new book, The New Media Invasion, about, all the new gadgets that we have now with the internet, and especially the internet, is disintegrating the whole Gutenbergian world of printed books and printed matter and linear thought processes. All of that is being disintegrated by the internet. So I thought it was necessary to go back and look at one of the main source texts of my thinking, and also of the thinking that led to the traditions of Toynbee and Borkenau and Gebser and all of those responses to the Spenglerian tradition. And that's it.